for joining us here at Lincoln Cottage. This is a real treat. The reason why we've gathered here and why you all have come is because at the Jack Kemp Foundation, we want to hear from national political leaders about their vision for the American idea. And it's a real privilege and honor to have Senator Ted Cruz with us for our first Kemp Forum on the vision for the American idea. A little background about where we are. This was President and Mrs. Lincoln's bedroom. And 153 years ago this summer, President Lincoln was writing the Emancipation Proclamation from this room. There's a replica desk over there, and he didn't sleep a whole lot, so we believe that he did his writing here. So in many respects, this is hallowed ground. The American idea, as we know, is best described in the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's appropriate to start off talking about vision for the American idea. Just reminding all of us, and myself, this has been a good exercise for myself, about what the Declaration says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And here's a critical part. What follows it directly is really important. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Can you finish it? I'm working on it. Among men, deriving their powers, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the beautiful ideas that formed the Declaration of Independence were clearly intended to be followed by a constitution. And Senator Cruz, having you here, a constitutional expert, a senator, Senator Lieberman having you here, your experience in incredible public service, being a close friend of my father's, it's a real honor and treat to have you all here. The mission of the Jack Kemp Foundation is to develop, engage, and recognize exceptional leaders who champion the American idea. Today we're engaging exceptional leaders who champion the American idea. And it's also appropriate that yesterday was my father's 80th birthday, July 13th, 1935, and I certainly appreciate the legacy that he left. And one other comment before we really begin. My dad was passionate about many things, and certainly he was passionate about the American idea. One of his good friends, and I'm privileged to call him a friend as well, Dennis Prager, talks about the American idea as being an American trinity. On every coin, each of us will read 3 words or phrases: liberty, in God we trust, and e pluribus unum. And that final one, e pluribus unum, is where I'd like to start. Many of you know the story of my father. He's the son of a truck driver, or a guy who started a delivery service and bought a bunch of trucks. He was an entrepreneur. Out of many, one. Each of us in this room comes from a background, a personal background. We have fathers, mothers, uncles, grandparents, and just thinking about e pluribus unum and the gratitude that I have to my dad and my mom, Joanne, who's here. I'm really grateful that each of us is standing on the shoulders of great men and women who have come before us. And Senator Lieberman, before Senator Cruz, you talk a little bit about your father, Rafael Cruz, and the story of how you kind of came to understand the American idea. Would you share with us the story of your family and your father, and start to talk about your vision and understanding of the American idea.
Thanks, Jimmy. It's great to be here. When Jimmy called me, I'm really here as a moderator, so it's good to, and it's an honor to be with Senator Ted Cruz, who's a real man of ideas. So when Jimmy called me, I figured I had to change my schedule because I acknowledged to him that it's very hard for me to turn down a request from any member of the Kemp family. Jack was a hero of mine. He was a remarkable figure, an inspiration, a real uniter, and he combined both amazing, I guess I'd say, cerebral skills and visceral strength. So he was both a man of ideas in the brain and also a person of extraordinary warmth and passion, and he just made a lot of things happen. I think one of the highest compliments I ever received is that he said to me once he considered himself to be a Lieberman Democrat. And I said quite sincerely that therefore I was designating myself a Kemp Republican. and I still feel that way. Okay, so about my dad, because a lot of this does come from your own experience. I mean, I'll start with my grandmother. My mother's mother, we were in the house together for the first 8 years of my life until my dad made enough to buy our own house, and then my grandmother came with us. Why do I mention my grandmother? She was my link to the old country. We called it the old country. In her case, it was Romania, now Ukraine. So all four of my grandparents were immigrants, but my grandmother was the one who was really in my life. And, I always used to say she was one of the greatest American patriots I ever met because she had something to compare America to. And that's one of the gifts that the succeeding generations of immigrants have given us, because I think they appreciate the American idea, American experience sometimes more than the rest of us. My dad was a story, really. He had a very tough childhood, but he never complained about it, and I didn't find it out. I knew his mother, who I never met, died in the flu epidemic in 1918. His father felt he couldn't take care of him and put him in an orphanage. And he was in an orphanage from the age of 3 to 10 until his dad remarried and took him out, and came out of high school in the Depression. To me, just one of the smartest, most learned people I ever met, but he just didn't have the opportunity to go to college. Worked on a bakery truck, worked in a store, worked in a factory, met my mom. They were in the liquor business. They had stores. Well, each uncle had a store, and they said to my dad, they would put him in a store of his own, but he'd have to make $25 a week before they let him marry my mother. This was a tough deal, but it was a great incentive system. And he did that rapidly. I don't want to go into all the detail. I married my mom. They were wonderful parents. So I grew up with this sense of tremendous, neither one of my parents went to college. I grew up with a real sense of sort of opportunity and blessing, that's what, in some ways, to be sort of self-analytical about it, a lot of the motivation I had in life was because I had this sense that my father had been deprived of the opportunities that his God-given talents would normally have given him. And, the home was very patriotic. My family was primarily Democratic, although my dad, when I was like a later teenager, and this may be the seed of some of my later troubles of independence, admitted to me that he voted for Wendell Willkie in 1944. Anyway, so but I grew up with, God bless America, and, the dream. If you work hard and play by the rules, in this country, there's no limit to how far you can go. And what can I say? I've lived that dream, thank God.
Thank you. Senator Cruz, would you share with us, you wrote in your book, A Time for Truth, which I believe may pay some homage to Bill Simon's book, A Time for Truth.
Indeed.
But would you share a little bit about what you wrote in that book, about your father, Raphael, and your kind of coming to understanding of the American idea?
Well, sure, and let me say, Jimmy, thank you for having me here, and let me first just pay tribute to your dad, wish him happy birthday from yesterday, and I'll tell you, your dad and Ronald Reagan, I grew up with there being two of my heroes as a kid. When I was elected to the Senate, it so happened that I won the Republican nomination on what would have been Milton Friedman's 100th birthday. And so that night I paid tribute to Uncle Milty, who wasn't with us. And I'll tell you, your dad, I think, was an extraordinarily inspiring leader. I think he was Ronald Reagan's natural ideological heir and successor. And he had a passion and vision that freedom is all about lifting people up to the American dream. And that, for me, has been right at my animating core. It's why I was drawn to politics in the first place, is to endeavor to follow a similar path, although I'm quite confident I will never be a starting quarterback in the NFL. So it won't be exactly the same path.
You never know.
But as you noted, out of many one, we are all stitched together from the fabrics of our family stories. And my mom is Irish-Italian from Wilmington, Delaware, grew up in a working class family. Her mother was the second youngest of 17 kids. As I like to joke, they were Irish Catholic. They didn't know what else to do on a Saturday night. Actually, her uncle, I discovered this in the process of writing my book, I discovered that her uncle, I guess my great uncle, ran the numbers in Wilmington, Delaware. I mean, he was a mobster. And his mom used to take the numbers, and she'd get 2 soup pots, nest them together, and carry the numbers between the soup pots. And this little old lady would walk down the streets of Wilmington carrying the numbers for the bookies that were in Wilmington. And so that was her family. And she ended up becoming the first person in her family ever to go to college. My grandfather, her dad, was a difficult man. He was a drunk. And he didn't think that women should be educated. And my mom, who is 80 now, she was the same age as your dad, my mom stood up to her dad. And she's got a steel backbone. She stood up to her dad and ended up being the first woman in her family to go to college. And she went to Rice, graduated in 1956 with a degree in math, and became a computer programmer in the 1950s, really pioneering in an industry where there were very few women. And my dad, likewise, his journey, he was born in Cuba. It was interesting, Joe, I didn't realize one way our histories intersect. You mentioned that your dad's mom had died in the flu epidemic.
Yes.
My grandfather's father died in that same flu epidemic. And so my grandfather was in Cuba, and his dad died in the flu epidemic, and so he found himself as a teenager living on a sugar plantation. And it was essentially a company town where everyone in the sugar plantation was paid in scrip at the store. And then all your expenses were charged, and effectively it was indentured servitude. You never got paid anything. You just stayed there and worked the sugar plantation. And my grandfather, when he was a teenager, a bus came by offering people $5 and a sandwich to come to a political rally. And my grandfather got on that bus and vowed never to come back again. And he went to Matanzas, a beach town, and went to work at a little fruit stand on the beach and slept on the floor of the fruit stand. And over time, he saved up money, sent money to his mom and to his siblings. And over time, he bought the fruit stand and then expanded it into a grocery store. And my dad grew up, in some ways, Cuba in the 1950s, it was idyllic. I mean, he would go to baseball games. He'd go fishing with his dad. My father would tell me, in Cuba, they didn't tend to use a rod and reel. They'd use a monofilament, basically fishing line wrapped around a stick or something. So when you were pulling a fish in, it would cut you because you'd be pulling on the line. So my dad said, Cuban fish stories, you'd show the cut. And the bigger the cut, the bigger the fish must have been that you were wrestling with. And my dad, as a teenager, became involved in the Cuban Revolution. And it was interesting. The revolution in Cuba started in the high schools, started in the colleges. It was the student councils. My dad was a teenage kid in high school student council, got recruited by another student, come fight against Batista, who was cruel, who was corrupt. And my father spent several years fighting in the revolution. And when he was 17, he was thrown in prison, and he was tortured. Batista's soldiers They'd come in every couple hours with billy clubs and just beat the living daylights out of him. They broke his nose. They shattered his teeth. And at that point, my grandfather said to my dad, he said, look, he got out of jail. They released him, and they were following him, hoping he would lead him to others in the underground. And my grandfather said, look, you got to get out of the country. They're just going to kill you now. And so my father applied to 3 U.S. universities, the University of Miami, LSU, and University of Texas. And UT was the first one to let him in. So he showed up in the United States in 1957. He was 18. He didn't speak English. He had nothing. They wouldn't let him take anything with him. His only possession, he had a slide rule in his pocket. He had $100 in his underwear that my grandmother sewed it there so that they wouldn't take it from him when he was leaving. And he got a job washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. And he got that job because you didn't have to speak English to wash dishes. You had to be able to take a dish and put it under hot water and scrub it. And he could do that in any language. And he worked 7 days a week and paid his way through school and went on to start a small business. And today he's a pastor. But my parents' experience, particularly my dad's journey of fleeing oppression and coming to America seeking freedom, it really is at the heart of what drew me to politics, and really where my passion lies, is that we have been a beacon of freedom for the world and a land of opportunity. That there's no nation on earth. You know, Joe talks about his grandparents all being immigrants coming from the old country. Right. I mean, this nation, no place on earth has allowed so many millions of people to come with nothing and achieve anything. And I think that's what we need to fight to preserve and to bring back more than anything.
So we want this to be a conversation. Senator, anytime you have something that you want to jump in with.
Well, Ted just said something that I'm going to build on, and I'm looking here because I got a quote from Jack.
Good.
Jack said, I think in 1998, as powerful as we are, our future will not be secure unless we use that power to create a world which honors those things which we hold sacred. So it's a wonderful quote. So the question I would ask you is, and we've struggled with this over our history, to what extent do you think we have an obligation to take the American idea, which I think, as Jimmy phrased it, is probably what most people would say. It's in essence articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Right. Do we have an obligation to try to take that universal statement of human rights and make it real around the world?
It's a great question. It's obviously a fundamental question of foreign policy that we've wrestled with back and forth between realists and neocons and one slice of school or another. You know, my view, I think the United States should always be a clarion voice for freedom. That there is a role the president can play in the bully pulpit of speaking for freedom that has power. And it's something that Ronald Reagan exemplified. To speak out. Now, there's a difference between speaking for freedom and committing U.S. military force to intervention. I think those standards are very different. I think the standard for military force should be defending the vital national security interest of the United States, but speaking the truth to power has enormous impact. You know, a couple of years ago, I visited with Natan Sharansky in Jerusalem, and he described how the Soviet prisoners in the Gulag would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what President Reagan said?
It's true.
Evil empire, ash heap of history, tear down this wall. You know, in my office in the Senate, I've got a painting. It's about a 20-foot painting. It's a beautiful painting of Reagan standing before the Brandenburg Gate. Mm-hmm. And above it, written in German, are the words, tear down this wall. I think the most important words that any leader has uttered in modern times. And that voice, that clarion voice for freedom, has power. You know, before we sat down, Joe, you and I were talking about the Iran deal today, and I think you and I have much common ground in that we think this deal is a catastrophic mistake. There are many aspects to talk about that I suspect we'll get into, but one point, just beginning on where we were talking about being a voice for freedom, one of the saddest aspects of President Obama's speech today is that he did not utter a word about the Americans languishing in Iranian prisons. He didn't utter the name of Pastor Saeed Abedini. He didn't mention Amir Hekmati. He didn't mention Jason Razian. He didn't mention Robert Levinson. These are Americans who are imprisoned for professing their Christian faith or for acting as a journalist and exercising their First Amendment rights. And for the President of the United States to celebrate with a nation that is wrongfully imprisoning Americans is such a stark contrast to the history of American presidents speaking out for the oppressed and giving a voice to the aspirations of freedom.
Well said.
So on that point, and because you brought up Iran, which I think is just, this is an incredible moment in history, and we now have, what, 60 days? The Congress has 60 days to deal with this issue. How will you connect the underpinnings of our American philosophy to the argument I don't know the exact vehicle, but to oppose this agreement with Iran?
Well, I think for 60 days we're going to have a vigorous debate publicly about the national security implications of this deal. And one of the things I very much hope happens is that we focus on speaking the truth. I believe the truth has power. I think the consequences of this deal, it allows Iran to keep centrifuges, to keep uranium, to keep their ICBM program. It puts incredible restrictions on inspections. Remember, it wasn't too long ago we were promised that any agreement would have the most vigorous inspections in history. Well, this agreement gives Iran 14 days' notice before any inspections and the ability to appeal to an international tribunal. You know, it's worth stopping to think, what exactly is the logic behind giving a nation that you would suspect of cheating and building nuclear weapons 14 days' notice before you inspect anything? The only logic of that, the only thing that makes any sense, is to give them the time to remove whatever evidence you would discover. And that we agreed to it demonstrates that there's a political mandate behind this deal rather than a national security mandate. Likewise, the very end, I think unfortunately the administration so wanted a political deal. You know, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, described an Iranian nuclear deal as the Obamacare of the second term, which I think he meant as a compliment. One of the things that underscores how this was all about a domestic political legacy is at the very end the Iranians tossed in one more thing: lift the international moratorium on weapons, on ballistic missile materials coming into Iran. And apparently the administration said, okie doke, that's fine. Not only that, billions of dollars, if this agreement goes through, will flow into Iran. Iran is one of the leading state sponsors of terrorism in the world. Those billions of dollars will be given directly to Hamas, directly to Hezbollah, directly to the Houthis. If this deal goes through, and this is not an exaggeration, the United States government will become one of the leading financiers of international terrorism in the world. Our money will be used to murder Americans, to murder Israelis, to murder Europeans. I think this is catastrophically dangerous. And it will also set off a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. I will give credit to President Obama on one thing. He's managed to do something no one else has ever done, which is he has united the Israelis and the Arabs. Both are united that it is catastrophically dangerous for Iran to have nuclear weapons. And it is my hope in the next 60 days the American people hold each of our elected officials responsible for stopping a deal that endangers the safety and security of our country and, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has called it, is an existential threat to the nation of Israel.
Just to add to what Ted has said very briefly, this is I was trying to think if in my 24 years in the Senate I cast a vote, and I cast a lot of them that were significant, that will be as consequential as the vote that every member of Congress will cast on this agreement, because this really will affect the future security of America, the world. We're talking about the kind of world in which our children and grandchildren and beyond are going to grow up. It's that important. I testified this morning on a House committee, and I made this statement, and somebody, another person on the panel said, who actually supported the agreement, said he was trying to think of when the last time Congress was involved in an international relations matter, not a question of directly war or peace, treaty, whatever, that was as significant. And I thought it was fascinating. He went back to the League of Nations vote, which is a hell of a long time ago. So we're going to be tested, and hope people don't forget in all of this the application of the American idea to Iran, because it is a dictatorship. It locks up its political opponents. It kills a lot of them. It suppresses people based on their political views. The journalists are in jail. People based on their sexual orientation get terrorized. So this is not a. And some people say, well, you can't deal with that if you want to have an agreement with them. Well, during the toughest times of the Cold War, when we were negotiating arms control agreements with the Russians, we were also supporting the freedom fighters in the Soviet Union, whether it was Solidarity in Poland or the Refuseniks in Russia. Yeah. So,
well, and let me say something important on that, which is that I very much hope in the next 60 days that we see the reemergence of Joe Lieberman Democrats. You know, there used to be a long tradition of Scoop Jackson Democrats, of JFK,
right,
who stood vigorously against the communists, who took national security very, very seriously. That is becoming an endangered species among modern Senate Democrats. I hope the next 60 days prove me wrong. Nothing would make me happier than to see Democrat after Democrat after Democrat stand up and say, my partisan allegiance to the president is far less important than the duty I owe to the men and women who elected me to protect the national security of this country, to protect the safety of millions of Americans. That is the only thing that can stop this deal, is if enough Democrats are willing to set aside partisan loyalties and stand on principle. I hope that happens. And I think we're going to have 60 days of vigorous debate to see if it does or not.
Right.
It strikes me that a significant underpinning to the American idea is a recognition of the human condition. And in our society, we have become much more pluralistic. And we very clearly started out with Judeo-Christian values and principles. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the American Trinity, the American idea, includes "In God We Trust." I believe that our founders and most of our political leaders through the years believe that the principal fight in life was between good and evil. Today, speaking about good and evil is much more difficult because basically the question is asked, says who? Mm-hmm. And is the American idea arrogant? Are we claiming that we know you are evil, I'm good? I don't believe that that's the perception, but I think it's really important when you're having these conversations with the American people, with your fellow senators, how to have the conversation in a way that recognizes absolutes, good versus evil, without being absolutist in the demeanor. And I don't know if you have any guidance or perspective on that, but it seems to me that there is a humility in the recognition of our government and the need for addressing the human condition.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at it and then yield to the candidate. But no, you're absolutely right. So this is part of what's happened, that people lose we respect everybody, which is great. Our country has become very tolerant and accepting, but we shouldn't do that at the price of holding our tongues when we see something going on that we think is wrong, because really this is part of our religious heritage, but it's part of the moral heritage of humankind, that there are rights and there are wrongs. And if you don't stand up for the right, then ultimately the wrong will triumph. And I guess the question, really the important thing is to try to do it in a way that respects people who have a different opinion, but not to have that respect lead you to be quiet in defense of what you think is right. Reasoned debate. Senator Cruz is a great debater, and we've lost that ability in a lot of places in the country to have a good debate where people disagree, but they don't seem to hate each other, which that's the American, that was part of the American idea. That, as you know, the founders of the country had incredibly spirited, sometimes quite personal debates, but they kept it together for the good of the country, and that's what we have to do in our time.
You know, I think I very much agree with what Joe said, and I think you're exactly right, Jimmy, that we're a nation that was formed by men and women who were fleeing religious oppression and seeking to establish a land where every one of us could seek out the Lord God Almighty with all of our hearts, minds, and souls according to the dictates of our own conscience. Now, each of us may do this differently. Joe's a man who takes his faith seriously. His and my faith are different. But both of us, we live in a land where we can worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. And part of the American ideal, one of the most revolutionary aspects at the beginning of this country, was the understanding reflected in that portion of the Declaration that you quoted, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. For most of history, men and women had been told, your rights come from government. They're given by kings and queens by grace or whim to be taken away just as easily. The revolutionary idea that it's God Almighty that gives you the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not government. It is inherent in what it means to be a human being. That inverted sovereignty. It made clear that sovereignty begins with we the people. We lend sovereignty to the government, but it remains with the people. So when it comes to speaking out good and evil, truth matters. When ISIS is beheading children, when they are crucifying Christians, when they are taking Jordanian soldiers and putting them in cages and lighting them on fire, that is evil. There is no ambiguity about it. There is no middle ground about it. It is the face of evil. And truth has power that we need to speak up and speak in support of the inherent natural rights of every person.
So I was going to take off from that to take it to a slightly different place. Starting with James Madison, who said famously that if men were angels, government would not be necessary. So I think we can certify that men and women are not angels.
Indeed.
So, and presumably that some government is necessary, but it always then leads to the question of how much government is necessary, and how do you draw the line?
Well, you invoked that quote from Madison in the Federalist Papers. When I was in college, my senior thesis was entitled "Clipping the Wings of Angels," deriving from exactly that portion of the Federalist Papers. The great challenge is to enable those in government to perform their responsibilities, and yet at the same time oblige them to govern themselves. And I think the key of that, Jefferson, likewise, described the Constitution as chains to bind the mischief of government. There are certain essential facts the government has to perform. The first and most fundamental is protecting the national security of this nation. It's why it should be the overarching concern. There is nothing more important the United States Congress will do this year than debate and, I hope, vote down this Iran deal, because it goes to the very first responsibility of every member of the government. But more broadly, when it comes to how does the human spirit achieve the American dream? You know, one of the things your dad understood so powerfully is the incredible potential of everyone. And, you know, for a long time I've described my political philosophy as opportunity conservatism, which is that every issue we think about, we talk about, we should focus like a laser on opportunity, on easing the means of ascent up the economic ladder. We should view it through a Rawlsian lens. How does it impact the least off among us? How does it impact young people, African Americans, Hispanics, single moms, all the people struggling to climb the economic ladder? You know, I try to view issues through the lens of my dad. I try to ask, if my dad were still washing dishes today, making 50 cents an hour, how would a given policy help or hurt him? And all of our focus, I believe, and what your dad understood so powerfully, is that when we create an environment where small businesses prosper, where we unchain human liberty, where we allow people to create businesses and expand, that enables people like my dad to move up the economic ladder. You know, one of the things I was looking at, I pulled some numbers recently. Just looking at median income and comparing the current administration to the Reagan administration. Now, the policies of the current administration have been told to the American people, this helps the least off among us. And yet no one has been hurt more by the Obama economy than the most vulnerable among us, than young people, than Hispanics, than African Americans, than single moms. So from 2009 to 2013, median income across this country has dropped $2,120. That's median income of all Americans. By contrast, in the 8 years of Reagan, median income rose $5,555. Median income of every American went up 12%. Likewise, if you look at African Americans, from 2009 to 2013, median income for African Americans dropped $789 a year. Under President Reagan, from 1981 to 1989, median income for African Americans rose $5,008 a year. 18% increase in median income in just 8 years. And finally, you look at Hispanics. From 2009 to 13, median income for Hispanics has dropped $349 a year. Under Reagan, from 81 to 89, it rose $2,160 a year, 5.7%. The reason that I'm a conservative is because I believe the policies that best benefit teenage immigrants like my dad who are washing dishes, single moms who are waiting tables trying to provide for their kids. One of the things I describe in my book, a lot of folks in my family are single moms. My mom was a single mom for a period when my dad left her. My sister was a single mom. Both my aunts were single moms. That may be the hardest job in America, being a single mom. People who are struggling need an environment where they get better opportunities, better wages, and when we create that environment, that's something your dad understood so powerfully, and it is what has drawn me to fight for that every day in politics.
That was really beautifully said. I just want to add, you know this, but being in the Senate late 80s, 90s, watching Jack and really becoming his acolyte and supporter and partner, taking some very traditional Republican ideas, tax cuts, but then focusing them on poor neighborhoods and poor areas. So took a concept which was not popular among Democrats, cut the capital gains tax, but cut it really almost down to zero if you're investing in an enterprise zone or an empowerment zone.
Yeah, places that
Yeah, so and it worked.
Senator Cruz has been, he's got votes, and they just called the votes as he was leaving for 4 o'clock. Would you all join me in giving the senator a round of applause? He's got to go. We're going to continue. We're going to continue, but we're going to say goodbye and thank you so much. God bless you, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, and once again, happy birthday to your dad.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.